All right, so we are at the fourth week. I'm calling it a Tour of Worldviews. I initially was going to make this a part one and part two. I made way too many notes as a result, and so I'm going to be deviating from the actual technical notes a little bit just to be more conversational so I can make it all one class. But let's talk about what a worldview is first. I know it became sort of a household word if you've been in conservative evangelical churches and you've taken apologetics classes or things like that. You're used to this word, but you'd be interested to know that the word has fallen on some hard times of late. Of course, there's the influence of postmodernism, its criticism of there being anything like what they call a meta-narrative, big story. So any idea that you can say that there's one way of looking at the world that applies to everybody, that's arrogant, that's imperialistic, that's a Western, modern way of looking at things. And so postmodernism made that criticism against things like a worldview. But from a completely different camp, there's been a lot of what they call theological retrieval, going back to the sources of Reformed theology, and even behind that, more historic theology, the fathers, the medieval authors. And some of these people, I would say, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, have been a little bit too exuberant. They've discovered that the very word worldview and the concept comes to us from Kant and the German idealist right after him in the 19th century. And so they're flying off to the other extreme and throwing out the word from a different perspective. Because what they're looking at is saying what those guys meant in the 19th century is a more subjective view. So think of the word worldview for a second. If you've never heard of the word at all, one idea that might come into your mind is that all of reality is an idea coming into your mind. Actually, more accurately, it'd be like a cameraman turning to what he believes is newsworthy. Actually, the whole world is an extension, is a representation of certain categories that I already have in my mind. We call those presuppositions. And so I'm wrapping the whole world up in and out of my view. That's one thing you could think, and that is sort of what the German idealists, if I can oversimplify it, they would usually have one idea, but for them it was the wrong idea. It wasn't God. Something was fundamental or central, and a lot of theologians took this idea up and they developed what was called a central dogma method. But the basic idea was that all of history, all of human nature, pretty much everything could be explained in terms of this idea, but it wasn't something like God. It was something like the evolution of the species, or it was something like reason, things like that. And so that was sometimes called historic worldview thinking. And unfortunately, the modern Reformed tradition in some areas, especially among the Dutch, did begin to talk like this. Now, we get the idea of worldview in conservative evangelical circles a lot of times from those sources. There's sometimes called neo-Calvinism. And they have a lot of good things that they say, but sometimes they appropriated this idea a little too much in the German way of thinking. Now, this is not a class on that, but just to let you know, that's one of these obscure reasons why people are sort of dumping this idea of worldview and say, hey, can we come up with another idea for this? Now, I have my own suspicions of some of those people, but I personally like the word. You know, there's a way to use it that just means a Christian way of thinking. And if you can't say that there's a Christian way to think about everything, then we need to have a talk. Okay, so just be aware of that as we go on. What's a proper way to define this? People have had different definitions of it. One guy who wrote a textbook on philosophy said a worldview is a comprehensive view of reality in terms of which one attempts to understand and place everything, in other words, arrange everything, that comes before one's consciousness. Now, I was with him until the very end of that, because what do you mean by everything that comes before your mind? Like that, like the color of the wall there? And like something on my to-do list that I forgot to do, everything that comes before your mind? No, that's not really what we're talking about, not mundane things. Here we're talking about more ultimate things. So there's another book that was popular in Christian worldview circles, a guy named James Sire, who wrote a book called the universe next door, where he's surveying all these different worldviews, and he just defines it very concisely as a set of presuppositions. Now, one problem there is that you're right back to the eyeball. Just the presuppositions, just the basic things, and not the things that follow. So there's a potential problem there. Ronald Nash, in a book on worldview, gave a little bit more helpful definition. He says, in its simplest terms, a worldview is a set of beliefs about the most important issues in life. So see, he avoids the extreme of the mundane things that we're not talking about, but he also avoids the extreme that Sire was getting to, is a set of presuppositions, where it's just the fundamental, 5 or 6 things that we then start to impose those categories on everything. What, arbitrarily? There's no connection? So, of course, I know he's not saying that. But Nash says, it is a conceptual scheme by which we consciously or unconsciously place or fit everything we believe and by which we interpret and judge reality. Now, I used another word there that I want to define, the word presuppositions. And Francis Schaeffer introduced this word to a more popular level in the 60s and 70s among not just Reformed people, but evangelicals as a whole. And in a couple of his books, he used this diagram that you see me use all the time, the staircase diagram. And basically what that's showing, and I'm just going to show 2 examples of it, is 2 things. Number 1, how ideas move logically. In other words, even in one person's mind or in a single argument, something more fundamental is up here at the top of the stairs. And so the blue arrow is representing water trickling down the stairs. There's a natural flow and relationship that if you've got water up here, it's going downhill, right? And so that's representing a logical consequence, a necessary relationship between a more fundamental idea that Schaeffer's calling a presupposition and something that follows. If you accept this, you have to accept this. And what Schaeffer was saying is that in a Christian era, it's theology that's at the top, because here you're dealing with the biggest thing, namely God. Now, philosophy, the medieval people would say that theology is the queen of all sciences and philosophy is her handmaiden. So in another bit of imagery, I would represent God and the study of God as a sun in the center of a solar system. But the medieval people didn't quite have this, right? Because this is a heliocentric model. And then philosophy would be more like the gravity that is pulling all the planets in orbit around theology. It's serving the interests of theology by asking questions that the other orbiting planets like science and history and so on can't answer and not even ask. They're not equipped to ask those questions. That's what philosophy does. And it abstracts and brings us back to ultimate things, ultimately to God. And that's if it's doing its job. That's in a Christian era. And so then that trickles down to what you believe about man and the humanities and the sciences, and then that's picked up the man on the street in high culture. Well, when you take that sun out of the solar system, in a post-Christian or an anti-Christian era, you no longer have theology at the top. You have it nowhere. It's usually at the bottom. You don't even call it theology anymore. You call it anthropology or religion in a secular university. But you have anti-philosophies at the top. And if you accept the premises, if you cut out anything spiritual, cut out anything above the line, so to speak, then what you have trickling down the stairs is an entirely material universe. And if everything is material, then the highest court of appeals now is the hard sciences. Now the humanities become social sciences, whether it's economics, sociology, psychology, etc., anthropology, even the study of man. Now we're just studying this material blob of protoplasm, molecules in motion. And so that's becoming social science. When you see that, that is not value or content neutral. There's a lot of books written in the 60s and 70s trying to explain that to people, to say, when you see history being now called social science, or social sciences, or social studies is what they would sometimes call it, they're telling you, since atheism is true, that's what they're telling you on the front cover. History is no longer the study of man, which is fundamentally, he's an immaterial being that has a body. So you have this something spiritual going on too. Everything is assuming that man is purely material because everything is purely material. And then that trickles down. Schaeffer then makes a distinction between high culture and pop culture. And popular culture is just present tense culture. That's why you won't remember these guys do you remember today in 20, 30 years? Because it's just meant for consumption. You know, it's ugly. It's not beautiful. And you pick up the worst of the ideas through those art forms and so on. So that's Schaeffer's diagram. You'll see me make reference to it. But a presupposition is just something in relation to a lower thing. It's a higher thing. It's presupposed. Think of it as a premise, but it's more than a premise. It's a super premise. It's a meta-level premise. It's your ultimate commitments that begin to trickle down in what you look at everything else. So that's what a worldview is. But it's a little bit. But even if you have all that, you'll notice this. You'll sometimes say, well, somebody's worldview is materialism, but that's not big enough. And then you'll run into other people. Somebody else's worldview is humanism, and that's even smaller. And somebody else's worldview is liberalism. And it's like, well, that's only talking about politics or maybe culture. It's like their worldview is smaller than somebody else's. Or maybe it overlaps with another worldview. Some worldviews refer to a religion. Other worldviews refer to a political structure or even a philosophy, sometimes a method. Like, what's up with that? So I've developed this, and other authors have done this too, but I think a really concise way to do it is in these 5 basic categories. And that's our outline for today. Worldviews as metaphysics. In other words, what is everything? What's ultimate being? That's a lot of times what you're talking about. You can conceive of it as religions. You can conceive of it as philosophies. You can conceive of it as epochs, in other words, historical periods, and there's basically only 4 main ones. And then worldviews as ideologies. And you're going to see there's distinction between these, and you're like, well, how does this help us in apologetics? Well, number one, you have to know who you're talking to. So if it helped us in no other way, it would help us understand our audience in the same way as learning their language. But you'll see other ways that it helps as well. So let's get right into it. Worldviews as metaphysics. And I've divided this up into 2 categories in terms of quantity and quality. In other words, with quantity metaphysical worldviews, you're dealing with the question of how many. Is reality 1 or 2 or more? And then the second kind answers the question of what kind. Think of it as what kind of stuff. What's it made of? I know that's a silly way to put it if you're talking about immaterial reality, but it's just a simple way to get to the division of talking about worldviews in terms of the biggest thing. What is reality? That's why we're starting here. So with quantity metaphysics over here, there's really only a couple of players in the room. There's monism, dualism, and pluralism. And there's different shades of those. A monist would be someone who, from the word mono, he would hold that reality is one. You say, okay, so there's only one reality. Well, wait, then we're monists. Well, not so fast. Because it's not just saying that there's only one reality. It's saying there's only one thing. And when you put it like that, you're like, oh, that's a problem. Right. There's dualism that says reality is 2. And you say, okay, this has to be us, because then there's fundamentally God and there's everything else. Not so fast. That's true, but are they equal? They're opposite, but what do you mean by opposite too? Is one good and the other bad, so creation's bad? So there's different mistakes you can make with duality as well. And then there's pluralism. And here I just put this and then ... like literally because it could be what do they call it in the science fiction today? Multiverses, that's right. So there could be an infinite amount of these so you have a democracy of parts, because as that continues to go, well, which one's the biggest thing? Well, it's very difficult to say that one's bigger than another if there's multiple ultimate realities. And hold on to that when we start judging some of these worldviews. Okay, so what is a reason to reject monism? I sort of gave you a little bit of hint from a Christian perspective, but remember, if you're talking to a monist, he's not going to have any sympathy with that argument. Well, you should reject this because the Bible says such and such. They're going to be like, yeah, I'm a monist though, but I don't believe in the Bible. You haven't really given me a reason there. So let's apply our first test of logic to monism. And as always, we should take the most rigorous or respectable example. We don't want to set up a straw man and knock it down and say, well, we've done our business there. One of the early Greek philosophers a guy named Parmenides. He lived at a time that another guy, a little bit younger than him, Heraclitus, lived. So this is before Socrates, before Plato. They're called the pre-Socratics for this reason. And this guy, well, first Heraclitus said, he's the guy that said the only thing constant is change, or you can never step into the same river twice. That's the guy that came up with these sayings, Heraclitus. Parmenides and his followers saw that as a challenge to ethics. If that's true, that everything's changing, everything's in a state of flux, well, then you can't hold on to some fixed good. And so he says wrong anyway. Because, and I'll let R.C. Sproul summarize this, he described Parmenides saying this. He says, for Parmenides, if anything exists in an absolute way, it cannot change. So think about it. It's right there. If something's true at all, then that truth is always true. Well, that's true. So he says it cannot be and not be at the same time and in the same way. If it is becoming, it cannot be being. If it is not being, it is nothing. It must be absolutely or not at all. So I think this is a classic case, this guy Parmenides, of somebody who sees something true and he just rides that horse off into the sunset and he just loses his mind on balancing this out with other things. But Parmenides is the guy that said, everything that is. It kind of sounds like the law of identity that we've talked about, but he just drills at that spot and ignores everything else. This led to the awkward conclusion for him that change was an illusion. So one argument you can make against this is that, well, look around you. Things are changing. In other words, the argument is that's unempirical. It doesn't match up to what we see with our senses. Problem with that is that that's an incomplete argument because we've already seen that our senses can deceive us. So we have to make a stronger argument, and the argument, remember, in round one is always going to be the logic problem. This worldview fails basic logic. And this is going to be helpful when we run into Eastern worldviews, because you start saying that diversity and plurality is an illusion. What's my main rebuttal at that at first is, I disagree. And what's that meant to do? It's meant to say, well, here we have two contrasting opinions now. Now, he's going to rebut that and say, yes, I'm fine with that, though, but just like evil, error, your error, is actually an illusion. Okay? So you start to get into the loony house at this point with somebody that's saying that you're an extension. And I'm a very inconvenient extension of his mind, because here I am being irritating and saying, well, I disagree with you. And there's these contraries. But that's essentially going to be the root of all the problems in this worldview, that anything that is diverse, anything that is divergent or contrary, is going to be illogical. It's going to be a violation of the law of non-contradiction. Okay? Now let's move on to dualism, which seems, okay, this is going to be a little bit more respectable, because not only can it account for change, but it can account for logic, being and non-being, A and non-A, and so on. Our bigger problem with dualism up front is that there's going to be an equivocation. There's a way to mean dualism that's okay, and there's a way to mean it that's not okay. So Norman Geisler says this. This is my second quote that I don't have a slide for, and there's no more after that, don't worry, but I don't know why I don't have a slide for it. He says, in metaphysics, dualism is the belief that there are two co-eternal principles in conflict with each other. Let's stop right there. That's right? God versus Satan, right? Heaven and hell, eternity and time, right? Well, not so fast. He says, such as matter and form or spirit, matter versus spirit. Okay. Good versus evil. Think of light versus darkness as well. So he says, Platonism is an example of the former, and Zoroastrianism, Gnosticism, and Manichaeanism are examples of the latter. Now that last one, I'll just pick on that. Manichaeanism, that might not mean a whole lot to you, but Mani, not the guy from Ice Age. There was a guy from Asia that came over into North Africa when Augustine was first studying. And this cult, really, of Manichaeanism was really big on the duality of light versus darkness. And so it had a lot of similarity to Gnosticism. The problem, though, is that you had equal and opposite forms. How do you know which one's light, which one's darkness? Well, one helps me see, and the other, that leads to a problem. Here's another problem, though, and you probably detected this as I was describing dualism. A Christian theist, we have to distinguish between the creator and the creation. So you have a duality there, and it's an opposition. We have to make distinctions between eternal things and temporal things. We use the language, because the Bible does, of light versus darkness. We have to. That's true. That's necessary to reality. Spiritual things, bodily things. There are critics of classical theism that start to attack Augustine and other Orthodox Christians by saying, you see, you guys are just a bunch of Gnostics that put spiritual things over material things, that put light over darkness. But what's the mistake they're making? Those things are opposite to each other, but they're not equal. So all of Augustine's early writings are against Manichaeanism, and a lot of what he's doing is saying, you're right, these are opposites, but they're not equal opposites. One of them has to be original. The good has to be synonymous with being, or light, and evil has to be an absence or a deprivation, you use that word a lot, or privation of being. And so you have to, a little bit of background for reading some of Augustine's early works. So here's another way to say it, a little bit closer to our day. C.S. Lewis, in the beginning of Mere Christianity, is developing an argument for a moral law leading to a lawgiver. And one of the stops he makes along the way, and I won't develop this too much because we'll get to the moral argument a separate week, but just to give you an idea of what he's saying, the most respectable view next to the theistic view is this idea of deism. Sorry, not deism, dualism. And now I have the yin and yang symbol there, which is just one example, but that's not the whole thing. But he says, well, let's look at this idea of dualism, because it's true, there are two opposing forces here that we're talking about. But what's the problem with it? Well, he says, in dualism, and this is sort of my summary of Lewis on those pages, the two powers are both eternal. So that's where you're starting with, if you say two equal and opposite powers or realities. They're both eternal. Secondly, the two powers are independent of each other. So you're already starting to get a clue as to what's wrong with this. Thirdly, if you follow that, neither has any more right to call itself God than the other. Right? They're both eternal. They're both independent of the other, so they're both infinite, really. So then fourthly, you're sitting here calling one good and the other evil, but what do you mean by that? One is characterized by, and this might be your answer to that, well, one of them is characterized by cruelty and hatred. The other is characterized by love and mercy, but Lewis is going to push back against that. And he says this, now what do we mean when we call one of them the good power and the other the bad power? If being good meant simply joining the side you happen to fancy for no real reason, then good would not deserve to be called good. So we must mean that one of the two powers is actually wrong and the other actually right. But the moment you say that, you are putting into the universe a third thing in addition to the two powers, some law or standard or rule of good, which one of the powers conforms to and the other fails to conform to. But since the two powers are judged by this standard, then this standard, or the being who made this standard, is farther back and higher up than either of them. And he will be the real God. So in other words, if you say, well, it's just obvious, the one that's good is good. He loves the right things. And so, again, I'll use that statement, by what standard? Is he conforming to something outside of himself? Well, then he's not the real God. Or is this right, or this good, or this rule that defines what is good, something in his very being? So good has to be the same thing as ultimate being. Now, I won't steal too much of Lewis's thunders. We'll get to that in the moral argument week. But it gives a clue as to what is wrong with dualism. Now, what about this third one? When you hear pluralism, you might think right away religious pluralism. Many rivers lead to the same ocean. Oprah religion, right? That's religious pluralism. What too much of the church gets into. In fact, it's when I think of religious pluralism, I think of a very short step to universalism, if not already at universal, because universalism is just the idea that everyone's saved. Pluralism is the people that don't have the guts to go full way to that and say there's many rivers. Universalism would just say, why the wait? We're already there. We're already getting saved. But that's religious pluralism. It's actually distinct. Here we're talking about metaphysical pluralism. In other words, it has to do with how many ultimate realities are there. So they're not the same thing, but they are related. So you have to catch this. Because the person that says, well, there's many rivers that lead to the same ocean, they're not just claiming something about people's perspectives or their practices or their journey along the river. They're claiming something about the nature of the waterways. They're claiming something about the nature of reality and the ultimate reality that set up these waterways. We'll see a little bit more of what's wrong with that when we get to the parable of the blind men and the elephant. We'll do a week on agnosticism. But they are making a claim about ultimate reality. They are claiming to see all the rivers. I alone can see all of the rivers and all the waters. That everybody else is just on a float in one of these waterways going to God or ultimate reality or so. This is a metaphysical claim. This is a claim that this is the way the world is. This is what God is like. Okay? Now, the other side, I'll try to get to this a little bit quicker, quality metaphysical worldviews. And here I only have two main options, supernaturalism and naturalism. And this is the way that C.S. Lewis puts it in the beginning of his book on miracles, which we're going to do a week on the argument for God's existence from mind, and that comes from that book. But you can use the synonyms immaterialism and materialism. Trouble with materialism is that sometimes it's used to mean, keep up with the Joneses. He's a very materialistic person. And then immaterialism, who even uses that, right? So it's easier to just use this, in my opinion, supernaturalism versus naturalism. And naturalism basically says nature is all there is. Molecules in motion, the physical universe, that is reality. Supernaturalism says, yes, that exists, but there exists above and beyond that some immaterial reality that is more fundamental. And ultimately, various Christian authors will make the argument of why this has to be a mind with moral preferences that drives things and causes things. And the moment that this being wanted this lower realm, nature, to cease to exist, he could make it cease to exist as surely as he caused it to exist. So supernaturalism is saying that supernature is not just in addition to nature, it's not metaphysically dualistic, it's saying that supernature is superior. Everything about it is supreme, and everything about nature is dependent on supernaturalism. Now, here's the thing you have to know about naturalism moving forward, and this is all I'll say about it, because we'll get to a whole week on it. Really, we'll talk about it when we talk about science, too. So we'll talk a lot about naturalism, but just catch at this point that if you're a naturalist, the idea involves three fundamental ideas that you have to believe in, and it's what's going to come around to shoot you in the foot. And that is the idea that if nature is all there is, then everything has to be uniform. That's number one. Number two, it has to be closed. You'll hear the closed system of nature. Why does it have to be closed? Because there's nothing outside of it to come in. And it has to be an interlocking system of cause and effect. Everything that happens in this closed, uniform system could not have been otherwise. There's no such thing as otherwise. There is no other. And so everything was determined to happen exactly as it has happened. And if that's true, you can't, back to the staircases, you can't make an exception for man. Because if everything is interlocking cause and effect in a closed system, then man is an interlocking effect in a closed system. And man's mind is a closed system of interlocking cause and effect. I had to think this way. I had to do everything I did because of what came before it. One of those, machines right there. That's going to have massive implications on morality, on freedom, on logic. You're not going to be able to make sense of those things if nature is all there is. And I don't mean that in any kind of a gooey way. I mean that in a way that we're going to demonstrate eliminates those things, which will then eventually eliminate naturalism. But we'll let Lewis explain that when we get to that week. Okay, there's a lot of overlap between these, as we'll see, If you're committed to one of these, you can also be committed to one of these. You may have maybe been thinking that as we talked about them. This is just a framework to understand them. Secondly, hopefully we'll go quicker through these. Worldviews as religions. You'll notice right away that these are going to be monistic, and that these are going to have to be in some way either dualistic or at least pluralistic with respect to the gods. But of course, the funny thing about the Greeks is that they were materialists, but yet they believed these gods on Mount Olympus and so on. That's weird. Or they were split on the issue, and the philosophers had to come around to correct that aspect. And then you have deism, which is going to participate in some kind of duality, but it's going to be separated, which maybe that's a good way to sort of explain them all. But just real quickly about pantheism, and then we'll just say a couple of brief things about that. Pantheism is so named, pan, meaning all, and theos, meaning God. So with pantheism, the idea is that God is all, or all is God. Now, this might be very confusing because in Hinduism you have these millions of gods. So you're like, well, if Hinduism is this, how can it be this? But again, remember, there's overlap. We don't want to accuse any of these people of being coherent. If it seems like it's confusing, it's because they're confused. Now, when I do apologetics classes, I have no problem saying these are doctrines of demons. So the confusion there, the error there, there's a spiritual dynamic. There's a captivity going on there as well, and I'll bring that back in just a little bit. James Sire, I lied. There's a third quote that doesn't have a slide, sorry, but James Sire in his book Universe Next Door says about pantheistic monism that it is distinguished from other Eastern worldviews by its monism. For example, Hare Krishna does not fit in this worldview, for while it shares many of the characteristics of Eastern pantheistic monism, it declares that reality is ultimately personal. And you're going to get some difference here between Hinduism and Buddhism, not just historically, but in terms of where you end up and why. But at first, at least, there's going to be this assumption that all is one. So you're going to have to do things with diversity, just like we heard about Parmenides. And you see this in Hinduism. Sorry, that is small, but you have your notes, hopefully, and I'll read them. Sire chronicles 8 features of the Hindu version of this. And the point is not to be exhaustive. Again, it's just like those presuppositions. These are the main things. Number 1, this idea that's characterized in this way, Atman is Brahman, that's the soul of each and every human being, is the soul of the cosmos. By the way, there's people in the West who believed things like this, but that as a religion, it's out there. Number 2, some things are more one than others. You see what's happening here. They have to start accounting for the manyness. For example, well, if all is one and we're trying to connect with this one, why are we disconnected now? Like, what happened? Right? So you start asking some common sense questions. In fact, when somebody says that, my first thought, I don't know about you, is the pigs at Animal Farm. You know, all animals are equal. Some are more equal than others. Something's sticking out here already. 3, many, if not all, roads lead to the one. 4, to realize one's oneness with the cosmos is to pass beyond personality. 5, to realize one's oneness with the cosmos is to pass beyond knowledge. Same thing, it's to pass beyond good and evil. What are they doing? You're trying to overcome what you see with your eyes. Really, what you see with your mind. What you're seeing there is illusion. And so we have to get beyond this. Death is the end of the individual, personal existence, but it changes nothing in an individual's nature. And 8, to realize one's oneness with the one is to pass beyond time. Again, there's a bunch of questions you're going to start asking, and that's why these things exist. And don't worry about, well, how does reincarnation fit into this and all these different, how do the many gods fit into this? That's a different class for another day. All we're trying to do here is just explain how this is a worldview, how these pieces fit together, okay? But that is their answer to a lot of this, is that when you see a one and a not one, or a manyness, you're dealing there with illusion. The word Maya is used there for illusion. But there is a hierarchy. The more immaterial being is higher, and so you ascend to this oneness in your area of consciousness. And again, I said the West has this. Neoplatonism became this with Gnosticism. They would talk about the one, and there would be a mystical version of this, where salvation was to be enlightened and something like that. Again, I'm not going to get the differences between Buddhism and that and so on. One author in another book on apologetics, Kerduin, writes, "The primary contradiction of pantheism is that the two descriptions, world and God," remember that first circle, God equals world, world equal, or all, he says, "are irreconcilably mutually exclusive. Pantheists agree that God is infinite, yet the world is finite. Yet pantheism tells us that this description of reality as finite world and the description of reality as infinite God are both true. Can this be? Can something be both finite and infinite? The answer is clearly no." Now, when you drive someone to this conclusion, it's like what I was saying about Parmenides. They will have the escape hatch of saying, but that's an illusion. And then eventually, you're an illusion. This annoying conversation, if you want to be consistent. That's actually okay. Again, if you are in a room with 2 or 3 other bystanders and they see that, they will at least see you heeding the call of Paul where he says, "Let your reasonableness be known to all." You are at least showing, at least to that person, this is nonsense. Right. So sometimes it's not going to be convincing that person. Sometimes it's going to be exhibiting that for onlookers. Panentheism. What's the difference there? Very briefly, it just means God is in the world in some way. So unlike pantheism, this assumes that God is finite. And there's versions of this in the late 19th century in Christian circles. It wasn't Christian. You had something called process theology, where God was in process. He was growing in knowledge with the world and so on and so forth. So there's all sorts of reasons to learn this. So-called theologies in the church begin to embrace ideas like this. Polytheism is pretty obvious what that means. Augustine's City of God really forms one of the most famous arguments against the Greco-Roman, but in particular the Roman pantheon of gods. And the fundamental problems there, you can boil down to this. You have a multiplicity, a diversity of ultimate reference points. You can't have more than one ultimate reference point for reasons that we're going to see for weeks on end. But if you want to make it very practical, Augustine had, because he was responding to the argument that it's the Christians' fault that Rome has fallen. We can't pray to our gods anymore and so on. And so Augustine's essentially mocking them and saying, look, what kind of gods are these to begin with? If you have to rescue them outside the cities. And even while they lived for centuries, they created and inspired in your poets the most debased form of art, and they made a mockery of themselves, and they debased you. And he quotes all of their authors that are more famous like Cicero and Seneca, others not so much like Varro and Sallust, who all wrote to the effect that these arts are debased and that the Roman morality had fallen because of it long before Rome had fallen physically and even before Christ. And so you can't blame Christianity for that. But anyway, the first part of the City of God is just this decimation of polytheism. Beyond that, I mentioned demons before. Augustine floats the idea, he did more than float it, that what's behind all these false gods are demons. And beyond that, they're a bunch of flag chasers. That's the way we would say it today. You had the Trojan War, and when Troy fell and Rome eventually came up, you had these demons basically leaving, jumping ship, and then going to that stage of history with this new pantheon. And that's why the Roman gods had Greek counterparts. The god of war and all these different gods, the same one, but they had different names, different faces. And so Augustine's pointing out that these are really just demons that are getting you to worship them, and so on. Francis Schaeffer puts it in this way about the fall of Rome and the criticism of the pagan deities. He basically said they're not even divinity, they're amplified humanity. He says, like the Greeks, the Romans had no infinite God. This being so, they had no sufficient reference point intellectually. That is, they did not have anything big enough or permanent enough to which to relate either their thinking or their living. And that's another thing we're going to see about views that don't have an ultimate reference point. You must have a plurality of things because there's not just God. There's a creation that he's made, but you can't have many ultimate things for all sorts of reasons. Deism is this religion of fashion in the early modern West, where you had God, and they feigned the idea of the Christian God, but here they basically said, well, we don't need anything like Scripture or really anything supernatural, because nature is basically God's revelation to man. So God creates everything at the beginning, and then he steps out of the picture. And there's all sorts of reasons why they did this. Their embarrassment over supernature and so on. But if you cut God off from that picture, you eventually you have not just no revelation, but you don't have any miracles. You eventually don't have the incarnation. God does not step into the picture. Why would he? If he's a perfect creator, then he would never step into the picture because nothing would ever be imperfect. He would never have to tinker with it and so on. Well, that ended pretty quickly for a lot of reasons. Deism fell out of fashion, but that's what it is when we make reference to it later. There's other things I could say about New Age-ism, and people ask the question, is atheism a religion? We'll do a week on atheism, though, so we won't deal with that there. Sometimes when people say worldviews, they mean philosophies. So maybe the ism in question here is some kind of a worldview that people are trying to, remember that staircase, philosophy was just to ask the questions to bring things back to theology that these lower sciences were not equipped to ask. Well, when you cut theology off, it's like the chicken with his head cut off. He's still going through the motions, asking questions, but now he's only accepting standards that exist in his own mind, whether it be reason and his own axioms, his own starting points, and that's, where'd it go? Rationalism, over there. Over there on the right, let me explain my Venn diagram. That circle on the right are methods. In other words, these are philosophies that that say, we've got to stop the bleeding. We've got to have a starting point. We have to have some clear and distinct idea that serves as a basis for us to know what's true, that you can't doubt. For some people it was reason, rationalism. For some it was the senses and data, that's empiricism. And then you also, in the 20th century, when people forgot what was wrong with these, you had sort of a resurrection of empiricism in positivism. The circle on the left is more just a whole vision of things. It's a narrative of things. And these come later. It's sort of misleading. I should have put that on the left because historically it kind of goes that way. And then in the middle I have two that are kind of a hybrid of a method, a way of knowing truth or how to handle the truth question, and then a way to handle the reality and life question. And we're not going to get into all of these, but if you want a timeline, these two should have gone first, then this, then, I should have put them in order, then these, and then these, sorry, that one, 19th century, and then finally these two in the 20th century. But that doesn't matter so much anymore. Just when you see these kind of labels, these are worldviews, and the moment you say, well, some of these are smaller than other things, and some of these overlap with the others, but just don't forget, they don't know that. The reason why they've embraced these views is because they've not asked the question, what's ultimate? Or if they have asked the question, they've answered them in incoherent ways. Okay, fast forward. This is an easier picture. Because when we talk about worldviews as epoch, all we mean historically, the epochs of history, the eras, the time periods, and it's oversimplified. You could talk about different eras within these. But you're talking about an ancient way of looking at things, a medieval way of looking at things, an early modern, and then postmodern. And there's debate about whether or not postmodernism is really just sort of the logical extension of modernism, that it's not really ultimately getting beyond the modern worldview, which is another class for another day. But the reason this would matter, how do people think at various times, is because, number one, you can see the causes of ideas. Why do you believe this? Why did that thinker where did he get that from? You could see that, but you could also see maybe the objections. There's a fallacy called Bulverism. Lewis named it that, but you can call it chronological snobbery. If it's newer, it's truer. And one of the easiest ways to dismiss somebody's argument is to say, people don't believe that anymore. that kind of thing. Or we now know, and whenever you hear a sentence start like that, we totally don't know. It's just somebody bolstering their argument, hiding in the crowd of authorities and so on. But it's very helpful to know this, because sometimes you can also avoid blaming the wrong things. Some people will say, well, that's a modern idea. And you're like scratching your head and think, that's actually a Christian idea. What are they doing? Saying that showed up in the Enlightenment. People do this with natural rights like life, liberty, and property. They do this with truth, systematic theologies. Those are modern apologetics. The doctrine of inerrancy. Those are modern inventions. And you're like, no, they're not. People believe those things before that. What are they doing? What are they trying to do? They're trying to say it's arrogant. So they're borrowing from postmodern arguments against modernism and stuffing things that are unique to Christianity in the Enlightenment. So all of that to say, it's very, very helpful to know where the Christian view will agree with certain of these eras and where certain of these eras are borrowing from the Christian worldview and distorting their view. Okay, so you'll notice the question, is reality knowable? The ancients, the medievals, and the moderns would all say yes. Now, how reality is knowable, the modern worldview will start to differ from the medieval view. And then postmodernism would just say no. Now, there's always been representatives of that X in these, but they were in the minority. Is anything greater than matter? And that's where the modern worldview will start to say no. Sometimes the check and the X means they were split on the question. It's not something that characterized the whole age. Is reality a unity? Is it one? Postmodernism says no, but that comes out of a confusion that was already there in the modern worldview. Is history driving to some particular end? The ancients had a cyclical view of things. Postmodernists are just confused and suspicious of anybody that says that anyway. So they wind up in the same place. So it's helpful to know where these different views stand on all these different issues, because you could see the causes and things like that. Sometimes non-Christians will even perceive when the church is starting to play fast and loose with some of these things and copying the world. Sometimes the greatest enemies of the church will have to reprimand us in the process of doing that, like Nietzsche. Here's one example. There's the famous case of, is this in Thus Spoke There Zarathustra? I can't remember which book it is, but where Nietzsche has the madman with the lantern. And he's going through the camp and saying, where is God? Where is God? And everybody's laughing at him at first. This guy's nuts. And then eventually he seizes their attention by going on this rant and basically saying that we've killed him. And you've unchained, you think of Andy Stanley saying we have to unhitch ourselves from the Old Testament. Nietzsche was the first unhitcher. He said, we've unhitched ourselves from the sun, and we're spinning off into the universe. Now, he wasn't trying to do Christians a favor. He was saying that's a good thing. We don't want that morality and that goodness. That was the philosophy of the weak, trying to get back at the strong. We need to assert the strong man. So he wasn't doing us any favors, but he was calling modern Christians on their hypocrisy. Because modern Christians wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to get rid of the Christian worldview and system and beliefs and supernature, but it wanted to retain its morality. Even Bertrand Russell, during the height of World War II, and he was an atheist, he said what the world needs now is Christian love. And you see this now with Richard Dawkins, Elon Musk, and how many other people. I'm a cultural Christian. I was just kidding. We kind of like you Christians more than we like Muslims, it turns out. But they won't convert to the faith. They just realize that something's missing here. Well, Nietzsche he didn't care, but he was pointing out the hypocrisy. He says Christianity is a system, a whole view of things thought out together. By breaking one main concept out of it, the faith in God, one breaks the whole. Nothing necessarily remains in one's hands. So the value of this whole, looking at epochs and philosophies, the Germans had the word Zeitgeist, that word time and spirit. We smooth that out as the spirit of the age. There's a basic worldview, a way that people think in our culture around us, and we have to be aware of that, where that's coming from. So don't worry about what Nietzsche's view is and some of these other views, but the last one, there's Philosophies. Nietzsche's view is nihilism, if you wonder. Ideologies. I have this man looking over these people because he starts to look at things and not just people. He starts to get bigger and those people smaller, a bit like people on his chessboard. Because what people don't realize this, they use ideology and philosophy as synonyms. They're not. And this is not just a semantic issue. What distinguishes ideology is that you don't just have a descriptive, hey, this is the way the world is, as far as I can tell. You also have a normative. Because if the universe is all there is, then one way to handle that is kind of as an existentialist. You see that naturalism in the modern world leads to nihilism and Nietzsche, and we're just going to come up with our new morality, and we're going to exalt the strong man, and we're all going to get in line. The other alternative to that is the existentialist. You see that, and you're not happy with it, and you more emphasize the individual. But you also come up with your own morality. But the nihilist, on the right, you might say, following Nietzsche, or the Marxist on the left, or any number of ones in between, is going to see that this time and this place is all there is. Ideology is distinctly secular, secularist, believes that this time and this place is all there is. And if that's true, then I'm going to have a utopian element which follows. Because if this is the only thing that I have to shoot for, and you're in my way, then you're preventing heaven on earth, or the closest thing to immortality that we have. So ideology starts with the idea that everything is material, and the Marxists have language for this material analysis of things. Marx basically took Hegel, that believed in a sort of rational idealism that reality was going toward some ultimate goal, and for him it was a rational evolution. Marx took that idea, and then another guy named Feuerbach, who believed that everything was material, even Christianity, wrote a book called The Essence of Christianity. And Marx takes this together and comes up with a material dialectic. That instead of what Hegel called thesis and antithesis, and in the next generation you get a synthesis of that, and you keep progressing. For Marx, the conflict was between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The people that owned production and those that were the ones that really produced everything, laborers and so on. You had this class conflict, and that's the story of history, and everything was developing in that way. Well, even if you're not a Marxist, if you start here, this logically follows. If everything's material, man is completely material. So any talk about what man's good is, you're not talking about heaven anymore. His chief end is something material. And that becomes something collective. So if I ask you, well, what's the purpose of our political life together? Well, it's to fix the external problems, which are the only problems. And then it's a short step from there to say that somebody has to do this organizing. That's why he got really big, why everybody else got small. So ideologies are not just philosophies, they become self-deifying explanations of how things better develop, and that becomes this blinding way to describe how things have developed. There's a lot of things I can say from there, but let me open it up to questions or comments.